The red frame surrounds the altar, a wooden table clad with silver and decorated with gems and pearls until about the year 600. The altar stood under the arching ciborium, held up by twisted vine scroll columns still preserved in the basilica today. Either the Pope stood facing toward the grave of Peter, and thus facing toward the sunset, or the Pope turned his back on the grave of Peter and faced toward the people and the sunrise. One thing I'm going to refer to on occasion is which way you face, because people say they want to face east or something. Here, if you face east, you turn your back to Peter. You going to do that? Or, if facing east is so important, are you going to face Peter? What are you going to do? My point is to say, it doesn't seem so absolute as some people talk. The red indicates the 5 naves of the basilica. We like to say there's a center nave and 2 side aisles, but the Italians say there's 5 naves. The vertical green rectangle is the innovation. We may call it a transept. But note that this functions as another nave. It's so massive, so integrated. A nave which runs across all the other naves, a crossbar nave, a transversal nave. Around the year 600, Pope Gregory the Great reorganized the area around the shrine. The goal was to separate 2 different needs. 1, liturgy celebrated at the altar. 2, pilgrims to the shrine. These functions were divided over 2 levels. The liturgical place was created by raising the floor of the apse about 5 feet. The top of the encased grave was then fashioned into an altar. A ciborium was created over the altar shrine. The bishop's chair could then be placed at the head of the apse. When the Pope sat in the chair at the head of the apse, he faced toward the grave of Peter, toward the altar, toward the sunrise. It took over 500 years to achieve this synthesis. For the pilgrim, a small window was opened in the front of the shrine for veneration, and a crypt was constructed that led to the back of the shrine. The first ambo in Rome was constructed in the Basilica of St. Peter by Pope Pelagius II between 579 and 590. This is a reconstruction of the ambo. You can see it extends well into the transversal nave. This isn't the way any book you saw talks about an ambo. This is a different use of the term. This is going to be topsy-turvy. It must have looked somewhat like this ambo, which still stands in the Basilica of San Clemente. The red boxes show the twisting columns of the original Constantinian basilica still preserved in the 4 balconies surrounding the altar. The twisting columns of the Baldachin by Bernini are based on the original ones given by Constantine. Below the current altar is the grave of St. Peter. In front of the altar is this hole in the floor, called a confessio, which gives access to the original shrine and the grave of Peter. See the round circle in the middle of the confessio, in front of the illuminated shrine? That circular disc is directly beneath the top of the dome above. Where is the sanctuary? Here. The red lines indicate the top step at the altar. The top step is large enough for only the ministers at the altar. There's no room for a lectern or a chair. The green curve indicates the confessio, the hole in the floor in front of the altar. When the Pope wants to sit or stand in front of the altar, you can see him peeking out, the yellow section must be set up. It is like a bridge spanning the hole in the confessio. There is no permanent lectern, no permanent chair in this basilica. Where is the sanctuary? The way we use the term round here doesn't exist there. Line up the floor design and you will see the red line marks the center, which passes in front of the altar. The altar with its baldachin are not in the exact center of the basilica. The yellow line is an attempt to show the vertical line from the top of the dome to the circle in the floor in the crypt below. No, I want to say here, that vertical line passes in front of the altar, in front of the baldachin, down to the circle. Here is a floor plan of St. Peter's Basilica. You can see the black square in the center, the altar, is actually a little to the left of center. The red square indicates the chapel for the reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. Here is the tabernacle in the Blessed Sacrament chapel. Your question about the tabernacle, where do you put it? In St. Peter's, it's in its own chapel. It has never been on the altar at St. Peter's. Any comments, questions, insights? Travel log.
So in the yellow area where the Pope would sit, facing the altar that way, is he facing east or west?
He's facing the sunrise.
So he's not facing the altar.
Right now, he's standing at a lectern and he's facing toward the sunrise. He sits in a chair and faces the front door. When it's time for the Eucharist, he walks around and stands here and faces the altar, faces the people, faces the door, faces the sunrise, which is east. Sunrise. Yeah, I always try and say sunrise or sunset.
So where are the people? Everywhere. All the way around.
I always try and say sunrise and sunset because Christ did not say, I come to you as the cardinal direction east. When you say east, it loses its symbolic appeal. Yes?
It seems like maybe this is small, but it seems confusing, a little bit confusing.
Because it doesn't meet with our expectations from here. Because our world, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Less than 50 years after the fall of the Roman Empire in Constantinople. And just before the Reformation, and much of our world was created after the Reformation. But this preserves the older practice. When you say Rome is conservative, that doesn't mean they're narrow-minded. That means they hold on to the most ancient practices at the most important times. This is the most ancient practice.
I suppose our churches, most churches are small, so everything only has a certain space for all important parts, and it's easy to find our Lord. It's easy to know where am I in this church in relationship. But so to go to a big place like that would be difficult for me because everything is.
You walk into church here and you say, where do I genuflect? You walk into those churches, you don't see Italians confused at all. They know right where the Lord is, and they don't have to genuflect to him because it's in a chapel. They walk on by and go see the shrine of Peter. They can be very devout. It's just a different practice of the faith. This is the Lateran Basilica. The Cathedral of Rome is not St. Peter's, it's the Lateran. They don't really use the term cathedral because they have such old practices. The original Lateran Basilica was given by the Emperor Constantine to the Church and dedicated in the year 324 or 318. The main axis of the basilica faces northeast at 78.5 degrees. This apse is not oriented. The apse is not facing the sunrise. The front door is. In red, we would say that the basilica has a central nave with 2 side aisles on each side. The Italians say the basilica has 5 naves. The central nave ended in an apse, the rounded blue to the left. The chair of the Pope stood at the head of the apse, and a low bench ran along the curve of the apse. The apse was for the seating of the clergy. The altar, number 1, in the image, stood in the nave. Roman altars are in the nave. It was placed even with the second column in the nave, about 22 yards away from the papal chair in the apse. We presume the altar remains in the same place today. According to tradition, the apostles broke bread at this wooden table, now used as the altar. So they put the wooden table there, and then after several number of centuries, they decided to encase it in a marble altar. But Rome had wooden tables. The apostles. Are you going to get better than that? There is no unified transept. The Emperor Constantine donated a triumphal arch to this basilica. It stood even with the third column in the nave. It marks the transition to the place around the altar just beyond. You see the altars in the nave. In St. Peter's, it's in the center of the apse. The solid red lines indicate the original arrangement, a confusing jumble of rooms. These were torn down during the pontificate of Innocent II, 1130 to 1143, to create a unified transept. Like the transept at the old Basilica of St. Peter, this transept was so monumental that it was considered yet another nave, a cross nave, a transversal nave. You can see that the Lateran is now becoming more like the old Basilica of St. Peter. The floor had been all one level, inspired by the arrangement of St. Paul's outside the wall, which we shall see next. The floor of the entire transversal nave was raised higher than the floor of the 5 naves. So we'll see the influence of that from St. Paul's. The altar remained in place. Now the altar was located not in the nave, but in the transept, a considerable distance from the apse. Our parish church, down the street here, St. Benedict's Parish, has this same raised floor in a unified transept. Concerns? Okay. In the center of the image is the altar, with its monumental ciborium arching over it. To the right is the central nave. To the left is the transept. This end of the transept, that you can see, has a side entrance into the basilica. The apse is off the image to the left. You can see how the altar stands at the head of the central nave, while it stands in the transept. It's not relating to the apse at all. relating to the nave. On either side of the altar, you can see the steps up into the raised transept. At the head of the central nave is the triumphal arch, supported by massive pillars on each side. Just beyond the triumphal arch is the transept, and just within the transept is the altar, standing at the head of the central nave. On the other side of the transept is another triumphal arch, which leads into an extended apse, which we shall see later. Later developments of the Lateran, the red square frames the ambo. The lower part of this square frames one platform for proclaiming the gospel. The other part of the square frames a lesser platform for proclaiming the epistle. You can see that the ambo extends further down the nave. The four columns of the fastigium, the triumphal arch Constantine gave, separate on the one side the ambo for the liturgy of the word celebrated in the nave, from, on the other side, the altar for the Eucharistic liturgy. So now liturgy has two parts, two places, divided by a triumphal arch. The Lateran was not built over any tomb, but Pope Sergius, 844 to 847, went ahead and constructed a confessio under the altar, so that the Lateran would be more like the old Basilica of St. Peter. Because of this hole in the floor to the lower level, the Pope cannot really stand on this side of the altar. Rather, he stands on the far side of the altar and faces the people in the nave, faces the front entrance and the sunrise beyond, while the assembly gathers all around this central altar. In the Carolingian age, 9th century, the 800s, many churches were adapted with a confessio under the altar. When people argue about church architecture today, they say, oh, it's all based on the temple, or it's all based on facing the east. In Rome, it's based on having the grave of Peter, having the tomb of Paul, having the church Constantine donated. It functions on different criteria. Where is the sanctuary? Here's the cathedral. The steps around the altar are so confined that there is space only for the presider and a couple of ministers to stand on one side of the altar. The chair is far away at the head of the apse, and the lectern is elsewhere. Either there is no sanctuary, as we talk about it, or the entire church is a sanctuary. The altar has no tabernacle, no reredos or high back. There is no altar rail. People receive communion as we do, by forming a line and or Italians crowding and standing, although some kneel. You can see that the roof line of the church forms the shape of a cross. The major axis of this basilica faces 78.5 degrees east-northeast. This axis extends from the main entrance to the right, down along the central nave, which once included the medieval ambo, through the central altar, then along the extended apse to the cathedra of the Pope at the head of the apse. The liturgy is celebrated along this axis. The minor axis is the transept or cross nave or transversal nave. It extends from the top of the image, where the side entrance to the basilica is, behind the altar, to the other end of the transversal nave, where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in the tabernacle. This axis is the devotional axis. While the transept can be used for seating around the altar during a big papal liturgy. They fill the whole church. This transversal nave can also be arranged to focus on the tabernacle at the end. We are looking down the center line of the transversal nave. At the far end is the side entrance to the church. To the left is the apse, to the right is the central nave. The center line of this cross nave passes behind the altar. The altar is on the nave side of the transept, not on the apse side. We are looking along the length of the unified transept to the other end, extending off to the right. At the far end, we can see the 4 columns of the triumphal arch Constantine gave to the church. They now frame the tabernacle. The altar is located in the transept at the head of the nave, seen to the left, not at the entrance to the apse, some distance to the right. These are all surprises. That's why I call it Roman Basilica surprises, because we're not in I can't even finish it. The altar does not stand in the center under the ciborium, arching above. Because the altar is too big, it has to be set off-center, so that the Pope can easily set the gifts of bread and wine down on the altar directly below the center of the ciborium, arching above. We'll see that more tomorrow. I think they got that wrong in La Crosse. The apse was extended during the pontificate of Leo XIII, during the years 1876 to 1886. You can see the papal cathedra at the head of the apse. This is the Cathedra of Rome, not St. Peter's, which doesn't have a chair. On both sides of this extended apse is seating for the canons of the cathedral. While the parish church of St. Benedict in Atchison, down the hill here, is more humble, we have an extended apse with a rounded end. Here is a 3D image. You can see the central nave. The altar stands at the head of the nave, just beyond the triumphal arch, a far distance from the papal chair located at the head of the rounded apse. We'll see the baptistry tomorrow. It's the topmost building in this image. Any comments or frustrations, confusions, or just simple questions?
So, you keep repeating the question, where is the sanctuary? Does the term sanctuary not exist in Roman culture?
It doesn't.
Okay.
And it came into the Roman Missal only, was it the year 2000 or 2002, with the revisions to the general instruction of the Roman Missal, general instruction. If you speak Italian, the word santuario, sanctuary, is like La Crosse, Wisconsin. It's a destination for pilgrimage. It's not a holy enclosed area in a church. It's a shrine. The National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. is a sanctuary, the whole thing, because it's a destination shrine for pilgrimage. When Italians want to talk about what we call sanctuary, they often use the term presbyterium, presbytery. But the presbytery is properly the apse, where the clergy sit. That's the presbytery, where the clergy sit. Then the place around the altar is in the nave, and the ambos further down the nave. So terminology can be confusing, and it's very helpful to be clear. They don't have sanctuaries. And the Italians don't even talk that way. And it only entered the Roman Missal in 2000, 2002, in the general instruction, not in the order of Mass. Someone?
Tricept, what's that mean? The tricept.
Transept.
Oh, transept, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And when we talk about transepts here, I think people usually mean, here's the big nave of the church and the altar, and then there's this little square attached over here and a little square attached over here. We have two transepts, two extra blocks of space. This is a whole different way of understanding transept. It's a cross nave. And then you can do something with it. If you just call them little blocks here and there, people don't know what to do with it, and they don't get creative. But when it's a cross nave, you can do something like put the tabernacle, have a secondary axis for devotion.
So, Father, it seems like the altar is brought forward closer to the people. Is that to put it into the people's space?
To put it into the people's...
Well, those who are going to worship.
In St. Peter's, the altar was originally in the center of the apse because of the shrine. And then when they built the current St. Peter's, they put it almost in the very center of the whole thing, and everyone stands around it. And what does the Roman canon say? Memento Domine circumstantium omnium. Remember, O Lord, be mindful, O Lord, of all standing around. And there's St. Peter's. They're all standing around. There's no kneelers. You stand around. And if you want to kneel, you kneel on the marble floor. And what's the other one? The Lateran, the altar was in the nave. And then when they made the transept, then the altar was it was in the transversal nave, but it was on the side closer to the door, not the side closer to the apse. And now we're going to see St. Paul outside the walls with the same thing. I'm punching you. The Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the tomb of the Apostle Paul is under that altar. The vertical red line indicates the road from Rome above to Ostia below, the seaport at the mouth of the Tiber River. On this road, the red square indicates the Basilica of St. Paul. The blue, to the right, indicates the hills. The green indicates the swamps, malarial swamps to the left. In the year 324, Pope Sylvester dedicated a small church built over the tomb of the Apostle Paul at the command of the Emperor Constantine. The little church was located on the left-hand side of the road, between the road and the swamp. The front door faced the road and the sunrise. The apse faced toward the sunset. Let me see. You can see the apse of the original small church in this apse. The tomb of Paul is just inside the grate. Do you see the curved wall? This is the curved wall of the original small church, and the tomb is just inside there. You can just peek at it. During the decade of the 390s, 3 emperors of Rome had the current major basilica constructed over the tomb of St. Paul. The new basilica was so large that it could not fit between the tomb of Paul and the road or the hills to the right. So they decided to rotate the basilica by 180 degrees. They used the tomb as a pivot point and turned the basilica around the saint, so that the apse now stands to the right, along the road, facing the sunrise. You see the road right here, facing toward the sunrise finally. And the front entrance stands to the left, facing toward the sunset. The main axis of the church faces 98.6 degrees, or almost due east. The basilica was patterned after the Basilica of St. Peter, but the differences were due to the lay of the land. The pink indicates 5 naves, the green is a transept which is so massive that it forms a cross nave, a transversal nave. The blue half circle is the apse. Because the land was not level, there was a slight ridge. The floor of the entire transept, or cross nave, is 3 steps higher than the floor of the 5 naves. This is the origin of the elevated transept. In Wichita, it's called Ridge Road. This is a close-up showing the red central nave, the green transversal nave, the blue the apse. The papal chair is located at the head of the apse. In the Basilica of St. Peter, the altar is in the center of the apse. But here, the altar is a considerable distance away from the apse. Rather, the altar stands on the opposite side of the transept, just beyond the triumphal arch at the head of the central nave. The distance from chair to altar is considerable. The distance is due to the space available on this side of the road. In this new basilica, the presider faced toward the sunrise. See the altar on the left of this image, and on the far right edge is the chair at the head of the apse. Note the vast distance between the altar and chair. You can see that this transept is a major nave. It's bigger than most of our churches, and that's the transept as a nave. The other 5 naves all extend to the left off the photo. Note the seating all around the altar. In the Basilica of St. Peter, the altar is in in the old Basilica of St. Peter, the altar is in the center of the apse, but here the altar stands on the opposite side of the transept. In this new basilica from the 390s, the presider stood on the left side of the altar with his back to the people and faced to the right toward the apse, toward the sunrise. I've given a vertical red line in the center of this image. It runs along the great pillar of the monumental arch. To the left of this arch is the central nave of 5 naves. To the right is the cross nave. Note how the altar stands in relation to the triumphal arch. The altar is at the head of the nave, just beyond the triumphal arch. The altar stands in the cross nave on the opposite side of the chair. Standing in the nave, we are looking toward the triumphal arch, supported by 2 massive columns. The altar stands at the head of the central nave, just beyond the triumphal arch. On the opposite side of the transept nave, at the head of the apse, is the papal chair, a considerable distance from the altar itself. Where is the sanctuary? The steps around the altar are so confined that there is space only for the presider and a couple of ministers on one side of the altar. The chair is far away at the head of the apse, and the lectern is elsewhere. They've lost their ambo. Either there is no sanctuary, or the entire church is a sanctuary. The altar has no tabernacle, no reredos or high back. There is no altar rail. People receive communion as we do by forming a line and standing, although some kneel. There is no hanging crucifix, only the processional cross. Today they build a giant hotel lobby and put a domineering crucifix and call it a Catholic church. The basilica was partially destroyed by fire in 1823. It was rebuilt to be even more like St. Peter's. This confessio was added so that pilgrims can walk down the steps into the lower level where they can look through the grating and see the tomb of the apostle, and they can look through the floor below them to see the curved foundation wall of the apse of the original small chapel here. With this confessio, the presider can no longer face toward the sunrise. Rather, the presider faces toward the sunset. Now the presider faces the people gathered in the nave and all around the altar as at St. Peter's. This change of direction happened during the pontificate of Pius IX, 1846 to 1876. People say we faced east exclusively until Vatican II. Mid-1800s, they changed this tomb over Paul's grave. There we are. I think I have only one more. And I want to keep the timing as best I can.